I want you to imagine this moment. A US president announces that he has canceled a second wave of military attacks on a sovereign country, not because a war was lost, not because peace was signed, but because cooperation was deemed sufficient. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and what you are witnessing here is not restraint. It is leverage, publicly displayed. Donald Trump says Venezuela released political prisoners, that it sought peace, that oil infrastructure talks were progressing. And in response, he paused the bombs while keeping the warships exactly where they are. This is how power speaks in the 21st century. Not with declarations of conquest, but with conditional mercy. If you care about how global order is actually enforced today, not how it is advertised, stay with me. Because what's unfolding in Venezuela is not an exception. It is a blueprint. And to understand it, we have to start by asking a harder question. What is really being negotiated here, peace, oil, or control? Let's step back. What appears on the surface to be a de-escalation is actually something more precise and more revealing. The United States did not withdraw. It recalibrated. Trump's message is clear. Military force is no longer a last resort. It is an active bargaining chip. Venezuela was not spared because the conflict ended, but because the incentives briefly aligned. Prisoners were released, at least in part. Oil cooperation was offered. Diplomatic channels were reopened cautiously, conditionally. And in response, Washington paused its hand without unclenching its fist. The Navy remains in place. Oil tankers are still seized. Investment rights are not negotiated with Caracas, but allocated by Washington. You're dealing with us directly, Trump told executives. Not Venezuela. That single sentence reframes the entire crisis. This is not regime change by invasion. It is regime management by pressure. And once you see that distinction, the story stops being about Venezuela's compliance and starts being about a system that rewards submission while preserving the threat of force. To understand how we arrived here, we need to trace the logic behind this strategy and where it comes from. To grasp that logic, we have to widen the lens and go back before the warships, before the seizures, before the social media announcements. For years, Venezuela existed in a gray zone. Sanctioned, isolated, diplomatically frozen, its government declared illegitimate. Its opposition recognized but unable to govern. That vacuum created a cycle. Pressure without resolution. Condemnation without replacement. What has changed now is not the objective control, stability, influence, but the method. Instead of waiting for internal collapse or clean democratic transition, Washington has shifted toward managed outcomes. Oil becomes leverage. Diplomatic recognition becomes conditional. Prisoner releases become proof of progress, even when incomplete. This is not improvisation. It follows a familiar economic rhythm. When sanctions fail to produce regime change, they evolve into bargaining tools. When isolation stalls, engagement is selectively restored but on unequal terms. Venezuela's crisis, then, is not just political. It is systemic, born from a world where sovereignty erodes under sustained pressure and survival depends on compliance. And once that door opens, the next shock is never far behind. Then came the moment when theory turned into spectacle. US Marines seize oil tankers in the Caribbean. An aircraft carrier sits just off Venezuela's coast. A second wave of attacks is openly discussed and just as publicly canceled. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a message. The seizure of the Olina was not about a single ship. It was about signaling reach. Trump made that clear when he said the tanker was on its way back to Venezuela, a reminder that nothing moves without permission. Even flags can be ignored. Even distance offers no shelter. And yet, almost simultaneously, Trump declared restraint. The strikes would not come. Not now. Cooperation had been acknowledged. This is the paradox at the heart of the crisis. Escalation and mercy delivered together. If you're trying to make sense of this, You should. That confusion is part of the mechanism. Uncertainty becomes pressure. Pressure becomes compliance. If you want to understand how modern power actually works beyond slogans and speeches, pay attention to moments like this. Because the real story is not the crisis you see. It's the system quietly operating underneath it. And that's what we need to uncover next. What's happening beneath the surface is not chaos. It's architecture. The system runs on 3 levers, and all 3 are visible in Venezuela. First, force without finality. Military power is deployed not to conquer, but to hover. Warships remain. Options stay open. Violence becomes a constant possibility rather than a single event. Second, economic gatekeeping. Oil is Venezuela's lifeline, and Washington positions itself as the gatekeeper. The US doesn't just allow investment, it selects who may profit. Caracas is sidelined from its own resources, while security guarantees are offered by a foreign power. Third, selective legitimacy. Diplomatic relations are restored not because democracy has been achieved, but because cooperation has begun. Prisoners are released, some, not all. Elections are postponed indefinitely. Progress is defined by behavior, not by rights. Together, these levers create a new model of control, not occupation, not partnership, but supervision. In this model, sovereignty is conditional. Compliance buys time. Resistance invites escalation. And once a country enters this framework, the next crisis is no longer a surprise, it's a feature. Which brings us to the second rupture, and why this story doesn't stop at Venezuela's borders. The pressure doesn't stay contained for long. It never does. As Venezuela is brought under this new form of supervision, the shockwaves move outward into Colombia, into the Caribbean, into the wider region, and suddenly the language shifts from oil tankers to insurgents, from diplomacy to joint operations. Colombia's president reveals that Trump spoke openly about preparing military actions. Bad things, he called them, not hypotheticals, plans, possibilities already in motion. The implication was unmistakable. What happened to Venezuela could happen elsewhere. At the same time, another justification emerges. The ELN, once a guerrilla movement, now labeled a cartel. Fighters crossing borders, drug routes blurring into political conflict. A perfect pretext for escalation. This is the second crisis, quieter but more dangerous. Because now, military force is no longer tied to regime change alone. It is tied to regional security, to cartels, to instability itself. And instability, once named, has no clear endpoint. When war becomes modular, deployable here, pause there, the map itself starts to feel temporary. And for ordinary people across the region, that uncertainty becomes a daily reality. Which brings us to the most overlooked question of all. What does this actually mean for you? If you live far from Caracas, it's easy to see this as strategy, as chess, as someone else's crisis. But if you live inside the system, you feel it differently. Because when power is conditional, so is your safety. You wake up not knowing whether cooperation is still enough, whether yesterday's gesture will protect you tomorrow, whether a deal struck over oil will quietly erase your rights. You hear announcements about prisoner releases, and then you wait. Families stand outside prisons. Names are read. Names are missing. You are told peace is coming, but the warships don't leave. And even if you're not Venezuelan, this should matter to you. Because this model does not stay local. It travels. It normalizes a world where stability is traded for submission, where democracy is postponed for later, and where pressure replaces consent. If this analysis helps you see what's really happening beneath the headlines, share it, talk about it, stay engaged. Because systems like this don't collapse from outrage. They persist through indifference. And the longer they persist, the more global they become. Which is why the consequences don't end here. They expand outward, reshaping the world beyond one country's borders. Look at the map and you'll see why this doesn't stop at one border. Venezuela is not isolated. It sits at the intersection of energy routes, migration flows, and regional security fault lines. When pressure is applied here, it reverberates outward. Oil markets adjust, diplomatic alignments shift, neighbors recalculate their risks. Spain prepares evacuations. Colombia worries about becoming the next pressure point. The Caribbean becomes a militarized corridor. Even Mexico enters the conversation not as a party to this crisis, but as a potential extension of it. What's striking is how quickly the language globalizes. Cartels, security, stability, joint operations, these are not country-specific terms. They are system-wide justifications. And once they're invoked, borders lose their meaning. Military logic overrides political nuance. Every fragile state begins to look like a case file. Every unresolved conflict becomes a potential theater. This is how regional crises become global patterns. Not through dramatic declarations, but through repetition. The same tools, the same logic, applied again and again, which leaves us facing the hardest question of all, not what happens next in Venezuela, but what kind of future this system is quietly preparing us for. The future, in this context, is not written in the pages of a peace treaty or a new political alliance. It is written in the quiet recalibrations of power. What happens in Venezuela and in Colombia, Mexico, the Caribbean will not be isolated events. They are part of a new playbook. A playbook where cooperation is demanded, not negotiated, where pressure becomes policy, and where sovereignty is something to be earned, not a given right. For Venezuela, this could mean a future of constant negotiation, a world where actions are weighed by their potential for cooperation or resistance, where the balance of power tips back and forth between diplomacy and military threats, but never finds resolution. For the region, it could mean a new normal, one where the US does not need to send waves of soldiers, but can rely on economic, diplomatic, and military leverage to shape the game, where decisions made behind closed doors echo in the streets, and the stakes for compliance are not abstract, they are immediate. And for the rest of the world, the lessons are clear. This is a new world order, one where might is not always visible, but its reach is undeniable. The question now is not what happens next, but who gets to decide the terms of the next conflict. And as we close, think carefully. This is not just a story about Venezuela. It is a story about the world we are building, one choice at a time. The power to shape that future lies in understanding these shifts. So share this, reflect on it, stay alert, because what happens here is happening everywhere.